I'm a psychologist and neuroscientist by training. And in the early part of my career, I was motivated by one particular question, which still is very pertinent to the work that we do. And the question is, why is it that some people are more vulnerable to life's slings and arrows, and why are others more resilient? In the early part of my career, I focused quite heavily on the negative or adversity side of this equation. I studied the brain mechanisms that confer vulnerability to stress and anxiety and depression. And all of that changed for me in 1992 when I first met His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama challenged me on that day in 1992 and very innocently asked, why can't we use the same tools of modern science that we use to study anxiety and depression and stress and fear and use those tools to study kindness and to study compassion? And that was a wake-up call for me that led to a dramatic pivot toward these positive qualities of the human mind. Now it turns out that the adversity side of things and the flourishing side of the human repertoire are intimately linked in very important and surprising ways. And so, in these few minutes that we have together, I'd like to share a few of the insights that we've gleaned from modern neuroscience that pertains to how the brain responds to both trauma and how the brain can actually be healed through the cultivation of the innate positive qualities that all human beings have the capacity for, and that fundamentally is to flourish. So let's begin on the adversity side. And there are two important concepts that are critical to introduce and understand that lie at the core of why it is that trauma can have the deleterious, devastating kinds of consequences that it does, and also why it is that we have the capacity for genuine healing and transformation. And those two concepts are these. The first is neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity refers to the notion that the brain can be changed in response to experience and in response to training. And in fact, we can go even further to say that the brain is really the organ that's built to change in response to experience. It is a an associative machine, if you will, that can learn from experience and is constantly being shaped by the forces around us. And one of the things that I often say is that the brain is constantly being shaped wittingly or unwittingly. And most of the time, our brain is being shaped unwittingly. Most of the time, there are forces around us that are impinging upon the brain, much of which we're unaware of. Yet we can document and demonstrate that these forces, this input, is indeed changing the brain, and in many cases can be having a deleterious effect on the brain. One of the other things I'm fond of reminding people is that today uh, we are all part of a grand experiment for which none of us have provided our informed consent. And of course, what I mean by that is we're all barraged with information online constantly. This has become, unfortunately, a part of our lives. And we know that much of this information can have a really toxic effect on our capacity to flourish. And so the flip side of this is that the um, strategies that we can deploy to train our mind and cultivate qualities like compassion and kindness, which I'll say more about in a few minutes, utilize the same mechanism of neuroplasticity, yet we can deploy it for the positive. So when trauma occurs, it induces deleterious consequences in the brain that can be very well documented. And these changes in the brain can, at least in part, be changed or influenced or reversed by training the mind. So, again, I'll unpack all of that in more detail in just a few moments. I want to introduce the second concept. I mentioned that there are two concepts that are really important in understanding how adversity affects the mind and the brain and the body, and also how transformation for the positive can occur. The second mechanism, in addition to neuroplasticity, is what we call epigenetics. Epigenetics is the science of how our genes are regulated. You can think of our genes having little volume controls that range from very low to very high. And one of the things that is so striking in modern research is to the finding that our genes are constantly being influenced, constantly being upregulated or downregulated by our environmental circumstances, by the conditions in which we live, by the inputs that we receive, by our emotional demeanor, by how we respond to stressful life challenges. All of that has been shown to influence our epigenetics, the extent to which different genes are turned on or turned off. And this has enormous consequences for understanding how trauma may affect the mind, brain, and body, and also how cultivating positive qualities of the mind can influence not only our mental outlook, but it can actually also change our physical bodies in ways that may be consequential for our health. So let's unpack this now a little bit. And what I'd like to do is share with you a little bit of research on the impact of trauma on the brain, and specifically violence, and how violence might be mediated in the brain, and then also talk about how we can intentionally change our brain, and through training our mind, and that can cultivate positive qualities to counteract some of these negative effects. So, a variety of research indicates that early life events, particularly early childhood adverse experiences, traumas, can have an effect on the brain. It can lead to a kind of scarring of the brain. And these changes in the brain are both structural and functional. By structural, we mean changes literally in the wiring of the brain, in the extent to which the brain is larger or smaller in different regions. uh, it's been found that exposure to trauma can affect all of these different components of brain structure, and also the functioning of the brain. And there are circuits in the brain that are really important for how we regulate our emotions. And these circuits include um, uh, three major networks in the brain. One network we call the default mode, another network we call the central executive network, and a third network is the salience network. These networks have different functions, they include different parts of the brain, they all work together, but the relationship among them, as well as some of their individual components, we know. Uh, um, can be affected by trauma, and those impacts can actually lead a person to be more predisposed to exhibiting violence. And one of the key mechanisms is the capacity to regulate our emotions. And one of the things that's been found among certain individuals who are prone to violence is differences in the circuitry involved in regulating emotions. And this circuitry involves interactions among the salience network, the central executive network, and the default mode network. So those changes that can be influenced by exposure to early childhood adverse experiences are also networks that we know can be influenced by training the mind. And there is um, um, training that has been described in many of the contemplative traditions, including the contemplative traditions of Asian origin, that have developed a technology for harnessing our innate capacities to train the mind to increase the capacity or increase the likelihood for expressing more virtuous qualities of the mind, qualities like mindfulness and compassion. So these are mediated through these various brain networks. And it's been found that even relatively modest amounts of training can, in fact, can impact measures of brain function and brain structure. So we know that training even as little as 7 hours over the course of 2 weeks is sufficient to produce meaningful changes in the brain, and specifically in these circuits that are really important for emotion regulation. So, just to give a very specific example from our own work, this is work that's been published in very high profile kinds of scientific journals. And what we've been able to show is that among people who've never meditated before, if they're randomly assigned to a training where they receive instruction on cultivating compassion. And what we mean by this is they're instructed to bring into their mind and their heart, for example, a loved one, and imagine a time in this loved one's life where they may have been experiencing some challenges, some difficulty, and then cultivate the genuine aspiration that they be relieved of that suffering. And you can use a simple phrase that you repeat several times silently in your mind, a phrase like, "May you be happy. May you be free of suffering." Something simple of that sort, whatever might resonate with you that has the same basic meaning. And you repeat it a few times in your mind, and then you move on to different categories of people. So we begin with a loved one, we then move on to ourselves, we then move on to a person that we call a stranger, a person who you recognize, but you may not know very well. It could be a person who works in the same office that you work in, but you don't really know much about their life. And here you imagine a time in their life when they may have had some challenge. And then you cultivate the same, aspiration that they be relieved of suffering. Very simple. And then from there, we move on to another category, which is really important, and that is to a difficult person, someone who may push your buttons, who may irritate you in some way, and do this for that person in a very genuine way where you bring them into your mind and your heart and you cultivate the aspiration that they be relieved of the challenge that they may have experienced or the difficulty that they've endured. And it turns out doing this for just 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks, a total of 7 hours, is sufficient to produce changes in the brain in these very same circuits that are abnormally impacted by early childhood trauma, which can lead to dysfunctions in emotion regulation and potentially increase vulnerability to violent kinds of outbursts because emotion becomes very dysregulated. So the important message here in all of this is that there are a few messages. One is that the very same mechanisms in our brain that are influenced by trauma are the mechanisms that we can harness for liberation, for awakening, um, for flourishing. And what this requires is the intentional cultivation of these qualities through a kind of simple mental exercise. One of the striking things about a quality like kindness or like compassion is that when we cultivate it in the way that I described, we're not cultivating it. Um, excuse me, we're not cultivating it out of nowhere, but rather these are qualities that are inherently a part of our mind from the very beginning. In fact, there is good research to show that humans exhibit what we might call innate basic goodness. That is, they come into the world with a preference or a bias, if you will, toward pro sociality. There is a predisposition for encounters that are cooperative, that are more compassionate, that are warm hearted. This is what humans are drawn to. And this research shows that if you, for example, look at the behavior of young infants when they first come into the world, and this research has started with 6-month-old infants, what you see is that infants at 6 months of age exhibit a strong preference for pro social encounters compared to encounters that may be aggressive or selfish or violent kinds of encounters. And so when we are cultivating qualities like kindness or compassion, we're not cultivating them out of nothing, but rather we're actually reminding ourselves of our true nature. And when we do this, it literally has been found to change the brain in these circuits that are so important for uh, regulating our emotions and ultimately for us to be able to flourish. Now, finally, I want to end by suggesting that these changes in the brain are what is really important um, uh, in enabling the changes that occur during the practice of these mental exercises, enabling those changes to endure. So these changes in the brain can last longer than the time when we're actually engaged in this mental exercise, and they can lead to these longer lasting changes, which we think are crucial in enabling these changes to infuse other aspects of our lives. So when we practice these simple forms of compassion training, it's not simply to be compassionate when we're practicing them, but of course it's to prepare ourselves to be compassionate wherever the opportunity arises as we go about our daily life. And the changes that occur in the brain are really essential in sustaining those changes and enabling them to be longer lasting. And finally, I want to end by suggesting that the epigenetic changes that I mentioned earlier, those changes may be important in altering bodily systems in a way that is health promoting. So, one of the things that happens with exposure to early childhood adverse kinds of experiences is that not only does it affect us mentally, but it affects us physically as well. There are physical changes that occur and that actually compromise our physical health. And one of the major influences in that is inflammation. Chronic inflammation is an important component of many chronic illnesses. And what's been found is that when we engage in training in compassion, for example, not only does it change the brain, but it induces epigenetic changes which have an important role to play in regulating inflammatory processes in the body, which ultimately may be responsible for improved physical health. So, to summarize, this is a whole mind, brain, body package, and the evidence indicates that early childhood adverse experiences and trauma can leave long lasting effects on the brain and the body, and that these very same mechanisms which allow this trauma to influence our brain and our body can be harnessed for the good. And through training our mind, we can change our brain and change our bodies in ways that can ultimately promote human flourishing. So I hope that these few minutes of remarks is helpful in understanding the scientific perspective in all of this. And I wish you all the best. Thank you.